Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this live stream from Soul Inquiry. As promised, this particular live stream, we're going to be discussing the idea of trauma, the concept of trauma, and how that's seen within the Islamic tradition. We're living in times of mass trauma and grief, in addition to the coronavirus pandemic. Many of us, just by the nature of just modernity, living in atomized worlds, and now, recently we've even got, the current riots that are taking place in America, and there's statistics pointing to Muslims making up the world's vast number of refugees and so on. So trauma is something that is something that we would say disproportionately the Ummah or may be experiencing. And how is this understood? Is this a contemporary phenomenon, or is trauma? Obviously, we understand trauma as something that's existed before, and so by extension, we should be able to tap into resources that are in our tradition, but also to use those resources to understand some of the contemporary articulations around trauma. So alhamdulillah, we have today with us Sidi Mazen Atassi, mashallah, a friend and someone who I respect a lot, and someone who has also trained under a common teacher, Hakim Archuletta. Sidi Mazen is a doctor of naturopathic medicine. He's the founder of Forward to Health, which is a wellness clinic, a holistic wellness clinic, and an educational initiative. His background, having been trained in naturopathic medicine, entails he practices natural medicine, and he weaves together homeopathy, herbalism, and hydrotherapy, having also trained in specific modalities of trauma therapy, such as somatic therapy, and I believe NAM, which Sidi Mazen will tell us more about, which is a way of treating trauma. He's studied with world-renowned teachers, and such as Hakim, who I mentioned, Hakim Archuletta, and has taken transmission from him. Maybe inshallah he'll tell us what that entails and how that came about. He also spent time studying in Amman in Jordan, studying Arabic at Qasid Institute and with local scholars, and he has patients and students across the world. So, Assalamu alaikum, Sidi Mazen.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Sidi. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for honoring us and agreeing to this live stream. Inshallah ta'ala, we really value your voice. So, inshallah, without any further ado, we'll just go straight into the questions that I've got a few questions to ask you, and then feel free to take as long as you want, and then we can open this up to some other listeners.
Great, thank you.
Right. The first question that comes to mind is trauma a new phenomenon? And if it's not, which I would understand it to be, then how do we see articulations of that in our tradition? And then how do we map that to what's currently out there?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd, alhamdulillah. So, is trauma a new phenomenon? It's an important question to have first, just to establish perhaps the conversation and what humanity, what the Bani Adam species of creation is meant to deal with this phenomenon through or by. I don't feel that trauma is a new phenomenon. I believe that trauma is embedded into the experience of the human being from the very inception. Coming from the attachment perspective, perhaps we can see how our father Adam, in some way, being sent down to earth might have been a trauma. Any type of grief is a trauma. Heartbreak is a trauma. And we know that the people of God, the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are often met with heartbreak and grief and loss and rejection and pain and suffering. And we organize that in a certain way. We have a framework of understanding suffering and evil. So these things have never really caused us too much duress. But the experience of human beings with loss and grief and overwhelm, which is what trauma in some way really is, has always been the case, you know. And you can even go back to the human being in their first moments of life, you know, when they're in the womb and they're just floating in this amazing sack of life-giving nutrients and warmth and protection, and they can feel the heartbeat of the mother. And you know, now we know that in some way the abdomen is somewhat permeable to light, and so during the daytime when the mother is outside, the baby can feel the nice orange yellow glow of the sun coming through the skin. And you know, the voice of the mother, the voice of the father being very comforting, everything being fed intra abdominally, and everything being good. And then at some point there's a type of fall, maybe we can call it. There's a type of rejection, we can call it, ejection, something like this. And it's very difficult. Now there's muscles contracting and there's pushing and there's force and there's no way to stay. There's no way back. Once that process begins, you have to go with the flow. You have to go with whatever Allah Ta'ala is decreeing in that moment. And it's not easy. And though once that process is over, you know, and we often say, you know, shaitan is the one who pokes you at the beginning of your life, and that's why you cry. Well, maybe that's the case. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. But, you know, the actual event of birth is also very traumatizing, and that's enough reason to cry for the child. And then, though, there's coming back to the mother, right? And you'll find this with every single type of trauma in the world that we have as human beings or as a collective, as a culture, as a society, whether we're being overrun by the hordes of the Mongols or, you know, whatever, you know, anything like this. There is always a type of return. There's always a type of reestablishment, inshallah ta'ala, of the balance. And during that process, Allah ta'ala ascends souls. Allah ta'ala brings souls to him, whether directly or spiritually, and then inshallah ta'ala directly later. You know, and so this cycle is ancient. It is part of our story. It is part of our genetic, spiritual DNA. It is part of our story. So in some ways, no, it's not new. But in other ways, with what you mentioned of modernity, there are expressions of trauma or specific experiences of trauma that are rather new. And we don't know how to deal with them. For example, the breakdown of the tribe, the breakdown of the family, the breakdown of like really true spiritual authority, right? The breakdown of initiation of young men into older men. These are massive traumas. For the Muslims, the loss of the Khilafah was a big trauma. I think we're still suffering that one. It's a big blow. The loss of structure and organization in any way, societally and culturally, the loss of the environment, these are all massive traumas, right? And so in some way, we haven't been able to really regain our balance yet from these blows. And so we're all suffering from this. And in some way, we have to be able to be curious enough and creative enough, find solutions for these problems that we may not have had to deal with previously. Our ancestors and our traditional ancestors. And so in some way, yeah, you know, it's not new, but also in some way it is new in that kind of way. So traditionally, you know, who dealt with trauma, who helped with trauma, who helped with healing? There is a phenomenon, there is a tradition of hikmah medicine, of the Hakim. And the Hakim was simply the healer, the doctor, the teacher, the helper, the supporter, the nourisher, the one who brought compassion and presence, brought an understanding of the nature of this cycle in some way, and help people along. Did he heal himself? Is the person actually, does he have powers? No, of course not. Allah Ta'ala Shafi. Allahumma Rabban Nas, Shfi al-Ba's. Anta Shafi, la shifa illa shifa'uk, shifa'an la yughadiru saqaman. That is the shi'ar maybe of the Hakim. You know, it's just Allah. It's not me. Don't look at me. I'm just here to support and educate you as to what is going on here. If there's trauma involved, great. If there is errors in lifestyle, then you should know. If there are chemicals affecting you, or some sort of environmental toxin or some sort of noxious substance that you are involved when at home, at work, whatever it is, that is affecting your physiology, that is affecting your psychobiological axis, your mind-body state. For God's sake, you should know about that. You should correct that. It is affecting everything that you're doing, including your ibadah, your worship. But is the Hakim actually doing the healing? Of course not. And so the Hakims have always been, and perhaps it is the most ancient of arts. And, these people use different modalities. Now, we don't really have a lot of material around the specific nature of these Hakims. We have a tradition more oral than book-based, unfortunately. Really unfortunately.
I mean, why would you say why would you say unfortunately? Do you think there is inherent wisdom in that not being book-based? Is there an inherent wisdom in such a tradition remaining orally transmitted? And
I said unfortunately.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it has been lost, and that is very unfortunate, because there is an inherent tradition that it would have been great to have access to. Right? Maybe it's there and I haven't met with it, but really there are amazing things that have happened in this community, like in Muslim Spain, and the hikmah of Muslim Spain and their architecture and the way that they organized their gardens and their cities and water and the air. And even I once heard that, they had technology in Muslim Spain that would have allowed them to really maybe move into the, Enlightenment or industrial ages before Europe did, really, in terms of development, in terms of this. And they made a conscious choice not to, because it would disrupt the balance with nature.
Yeah, because it wouldn't have been an enlightenment.
Sorry?
Yeah. Because had they taken that choice, it wouldn't have been enlightening. I mean, it wouldn't have been
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it would have been darkening, right? But you can see this hikmah. This takes an understanding of the patterns of nature and of man and of the social polity and all of that, to be able to identify, okay, we're at the balance point here. This is good. This is healthy. Let's just manage this here. Too much is excess, too little is deficient. We're still not capturing all that we can do of good. But let's find that balance and just strike it and manage it and govern it and regulate it and ask Allah, have shukr for Allah Ta'ala for allowing us to come here to maintain it here. So in some way that's needed.
And mashallah, just in that first answer, this is kind of opened up a kind of an orientation. And I think one of the ways that it's kind of opened up is that you've not defined trauma in a clinical sense, and you've not necessarily related it to a specific sense of shock, whether that be a shock that occurs later in life or in more early developmental stages, but you've more referred to it as that almost in that holistic state of being connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And just on that point, a thought comes to me as to one of my teachers, when we were discussing the hadith about fitra, kullu mawludin yulad ala fitra, every child is born upon fitra. And then the hadith goes on to mention Jewish, Christian, and Magian kind of parents, because it uses the dual. So my teacher kind of said the focus is on the parents here, not on the incidental description of religion. And he said it's the parents that somehow take the child out of the fitra. And I said, how is that possible? And he said, well, primarily the mother, and he says, shiddatul hub. The immensity of that love that the child has gets projected onto the mother, and the mother cannot meet that holistic connection as an object of being. And then I was thinking, within trauma therapy, there is a lady called Margaret Mailer who speaks about dual unity, the first separation from unified consciousness. And then the idea of trauma then becomes not just this kind of, okay, there's something gone wrong and I need to fix it, but an idea of connecting ourselves to that original imprint of Tawheed. And so everything that takes us out of that balance, everything that takes us, so things like qabd, if we're describing qabd or or bu'd anillah, or anything that has a state of separation is a type of trauma. And you gave the example of Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam. So, it's if that's how we understand trauma, then we're really seeing this as a very intrinsic element of something that we have to look at. Like, how do we cognize suffering? How do we see our journeying towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So the question I have, sorry about the long-winded comment, was, in essence, it seems like this comes back to our understanding of the world. I mean, you alluded to how a lot of people, are traumatized just by the fact that modernity doesn't provide meaning. And Carl Jung had this famous thing about the containing myth, the fact that people need an understanding of who they are and where they're going. And Western civilization is the one civilization that has created this rupture in terms of the people knowing who they are. And the Quran constantly poses the question, فَأَيْنَ تَذْهَبُونَ? Where are you headed? So how, in terms of our worldview of where we're headed, is trauma to be seen in terms of its resolution? And then further on in your discussion, maybe you could tie it to certain modalities that you practice and how consistent they are with that.
Can you repeat the first part of the question? I wasn't clear on the first part.
Sorry. So how, in terms of our overarching worldview, so an understanding of where are you headed, right? Do we see trauma? I mean, for example, is trauma for us? Is this something that is actually aiding us in terms of our journeying towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If this is the imperative that we have, and what is the imperative of us individually in terms of interacting with this felt sense of trauma? And then as a modality, then, if this is to be translated into a kind of a modality of treatment, what are the options out there, and what are the ones you specifically would like to advocate in terms of your practice?
Wonderful. So it is definitely important and central to our lives today and our moving back to Allah. No doubt. I really believe that. Not only in the spiritual sense, but also in our capacity to be more human here and allow us more access to ourselves and our gifts and our khidmah, whatever that may be, our contributions here, no doubt, right? Because we don't want to overly spiritualize it either. Like right now, people are suffering, and they're usually probably due to mostly from trauma. This is my hypothesis, my working hypothesis, is that trauma and toxins are the two things that modern man, if you will, is most suffering from after the loss of meaning and being uprooted from their tradition and their ancestry and what it means to be really human and God. But trauma and toxins, in some way, those two things are connected. Hakim once told me, he says, a toxin is anything that you do not assimilate or eliminate by definition. And that is what trauma really is. It's just something that you are so overwhelmed by a trauma, an experience, whether shock or childhood. And some people call the shock trauma the capital T trauma and the childhood trauma little t. I personally believe the childhood trauma is actually the capital T.
Right.
Just because of the implications are so much deeper. Shock trauma is more of a nervous system type of disturbance, where the childhood trauma can become a total overhaul of one's sense of self, one sense of belief about who they are and what the world is the world safe or not safe? God even gets, so many people come to me and say, look, I blame God for so much that has happened to me. Why would he do that? And I can't find love. I've been married 2-3 times, and there's something with relationally that comes in constantly, that comes in the way of me being able to really be happy. And it's like they want to be happy, they want connection, and yet connection terrifies them away from not connecting. And this is the paradox of trauma, specifically childhood trauma. And so there are things that we have to work with. Absolutely. Our ibadah is on the line. Our akhirah is on the line potentially because of these things. My belief is that this is ar-rahmah. Through and through, this is rahmah. But we have to allow people, to not shame themselves, not be shamed, to understand what's going on here, bring it back to Allah, and find good help to allow them to move through these different stages and out of it, right? It's so important that this happens. It's so important that this happens. And, we have this idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but there's also this other thing that is possible through trauma, which is post-traumatic growth, which is I would say the maqsad, the objective, the real meaning of it is that you go through this and you come out stronger. That there is a type of response that the soul is roused to make to the challenge, to the stressor, whatever it is. And in that you're awoken, in that you're mobilized, in that if you allow it, you can come back to life again if you've been stuck. How many times do we know of people that have been stuck, depressed, sad, just totally disconnected and dissociated from themselves, and then something will happen in their lives, maybe the loss of a loved one. And I've seen this. And they'll be now, for example, the eldest son is like this. The eldest son now becomes the leader of the household. And the loss of the father is big, of course. And yet you see them also grieving, but also something comes out of them. And now they can lead. And now they're kind of awoken to mortality. They're awoken to responsibility. They're awoken to life. And you see that. And it's a very powerful thing to witness. And if someone like that shares their story with you, you will be affected by that story, because it is a transformation of the soul, ultimately. Right? The human soul, of the animal soul, whatever you want to call it, there's different aspects of the soul, but these are such important things that we have to allow people to go through. And I believe firmly that our people in the past, Allah Ta'ala alam how they did it, but the nature of the community, the nature of the tribe was such that there was a natural container for these types of things. Always. There was love, there was connection, there was holding space, there was witnessing, there was the elder that would bless you with their, the rub on the head and say, I can't wait to see good things from you, young lad. And the father may not be able to say that properly, even though he might feel that. But the relationship is so muddled, perhaps, between parent and child. Like you mentioned, shiddatul hubb kind of stunts the growth or disconnects the child from their greater self, from God, from their fitrah. That's amazing. And it's true. And that's why they say in initiation, the father cannot initiate his son.
Right.
Nor can the mother, of course, for sure. But the father can't do it either as another man, because there's too much at stake. This is my baby boy. But that's why you need another man to bless, if you will, if I can use that word, to bless the child, to see the child and to acknowledge the child and to nourish that child along into adulthood and into his place in society. See, that was standard somehow. That was all there. People would eat together. They'd worship together. Idris Watts one time mentioned in a talk that he gave that the Mawlid itself and other institutions of dhikr, for example, the standing hadra, were things that the ulama made ijtihad over after recognizing that there was a type of trauma that has affected the community.
Right.
What a musibah. People have lost connection with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What a horrible fitna, what a disease we've been afflicted by. How do we fix this? Together, feed them, celebrate the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, spray the rose water on people, have them make dua, and the love returns.
Right.
The hadra, men being disconnected from one another and themselves. And so what do? We stand together, we hold hands, we move in unison, we make dhikr together. There is some drum, there is some sort of music or something, some inshad, some sama, just to bring the hearts and bring the bodies together. There was a recognition of the somatic piece. That's so important. We need to bring that creativity to this time. What do we need to bring today? And I'll put this back onto the ulama, because this is something that it should come from them. It should be blessed with the tradition in some way. It should be validated, perhaps, at least. and incorporated into a greater understanding of community
But then
care.
you've put the cat with the pigeons with that comment, Sidi Mazen, because in the examples you've given, there was this kind of evolution kind of through an intrinsic knowing, whether it was through the collective of a community, but always kind of guided and facilitated by a kind of spiritual leadership. And so in terms of the contemporary setting, and we still have many of these modalities there. We still have the group dhikr, we still have the molids, and part of this proliferation of trauma is aspects of modernizing Islam that seek to take these kind of things based in tradition outside of practice. But now we see another type of discourse, and this is also part of a trajectory originating through kind of let's say an extension of kind of a humanistic psychology kind of movement, where you have people like Peter Levine talking about somatic therapy. You may have, I think, what you're doing, neuroaffective relational kind of the model, NARM, which kind of integrates a lot of different models, attachment therapy, and integrates a lot of these different models. Now how would you potentially, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a contention, but it is a question that arises in terms of all of the examples you posited of a type of way of alleviating trauma arose in an organic way from within a Muslim community as a kind of dealing within the spiritual fabric. And you said the ulama have to be the ones to create a discourse. Then the question would then be, are they not? I mean, maybe there are modes within traditional formats that deal with these things, but then now we've got what could be construed as an other, right? But it is what people are going to from a position of necessity, right? Muslims aren't immune to the felt sense of trauma, especially in the Western world, and these modalities exist. Mindfulness is proliferating. You've got, somatic therapy and so on, and it works at some level, alleviating stress. Now, who provides the quality control? Who provides this kind of sense of, this is now within our traditional dynamic? Or someone could say, well, Peter Levine's origins are more Buddhist, and the way he attributes a lot of his inspiration to Tibetan Buddhists or so on. Is that necessarily an other? Is that, so how do we qualify? Do you get the question? Because if the ulama aren't doing it, who's doing it? And
I think there should be ideally a collaboration between the people that are on the ground doing this work, like the Hakims and the therapists and the naturopaths and so forth, and the ulama class that are, obviously the ones that are receptive to it. Not everyone's going to be receptive to it, but the ones that are interested in this work, that see the need. I've heard this work called, I think maybe you shared this with me, Fard Kifaya, right? In some way, that this work at some capacity is a Fard Kifaya. It's a communal obligation that we have people learn this, root it in our tradition, and then provide it as a service. Really. And so that is what is needed, absolutely. Right? The hikmah tradition is one of the great things is that, which I love about it. Perhaps one of the hikmahs of the hikmah tradition not being kind of drilled down in books and codified in some way, maybe we can say, but kind of more supple and more flexible and more context-based, is this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he says, "Al-hikmatu dalatul mu'min, fahaythu wajadaha fahuwa ahaqqu biha." And so there is hikmah out there, and it is our right. It is our haqq. It is your haqq, my haqq. It is the sister suffering down the street with abuse and this and that, or a narcissistic, companion, or parents that are abusive and emotionally unavailable for the child that grows up and learns to hate themselves and not, have self-loathing and just shake their hands at God, and then they know that that's difficult, and then that conflict within them, all of that. How do you help that person? Tell them to make dhikr? I'm sorry. You can try that. They can try that. I'm sure they have tried that. It's not what they need. And so we have to be able to look.
Why would dhikr not be what they need?
Well, Allah Ta'ala Alam, why? I mean, I'm working just with what I've heard people tell me. Like I went to the Imam, he told me read more Quran and pray Tawbah, and I do that. And of course, I don't want to seek other answers and have that be a way that I defy God through. I want to be closer to God. That's why I'm coming to you now. It's the intention is there for them. They love Allah. The Muslims love Allah. Wallahi, the Muslims love Allah. I'm getting teary just saying it. Wallahi, people, they want answers. They want help. And they're not getting help from the conventional sources that were supposed to be there for them. And not by any fault necessarily of those people. They have to be also taught and supported. But, in the meantime, who is doing the work of mining out this hikmah, these resources, these measures and these modalities, and rooting them back and running them past the ulama? Because people like me, I can't do it myself. I'm already kind of a quack, apparently, from what people as a naturopath. So now I'm going to be a heretic. I start making claims about what's haram and halal. No, please help me, right? Let's collaborate. Let's do this work together where we can begin to mine the hikmah wherever we find it. It's ours.
Have you found avenues for collaboration with ulama easy?
Some, of course. Some are not going to be receptive. Some are not receptive at all to any of my work. As a homeopath, as a naturopath, people I've had serious students of knowledge and asatidha and stuff like that really even argue with me online about what I do, and just not finding it to have any validity at all. So there's some people that say, no, just Quran, dhikr, tawbah, and that's good. And then there's others that say, listen, I'm with you. I see what you see, and let's work together. And that's the group that I'm really perhaps speaking to right now.
Well, one thing that comes to mind as someone who works with ulama, so I work in a fatwa department, and we deal also almost like a pastoral role. So it's not just fatwas don't just cover legalistic worship, but also aspects of life, and there's a proliferation of OCD, right? And what's termed scrupulosity in more religious circles. So that's a religious manifestation of OCD. And a lot of the traditional books kind of say the worst thing you can do in fatwa to answer someone who's got questions about should I do this and do that is to entertain their question, as in to actually give them a legalistic answer. What you're meant to do is to bring them back to community, resting, dhikr, to allow for this kind of thing to go away, to seek to alleviate it through other means. So the question came to mind that is interesting. Sheikh Darqawi, you're familiar with, in his own biography, he kind of details that he went through a position where he had a time when he had what could be termed waswasa. I mean, he had issues, and he felt that he was very troubled. And the only thing that worked for him was communion, being with community and feeling connected and feeling this. So what comes to me, and this is maybe something to explore in this, is that when a person is so alienated from a innate need, to try and just say do dhikr is kind of the surface level. It's kind of saying, let's put some really nice fertilizer on this ground. But you've got weeds there that really need to be dug into and de-weeded first. And unless we're meeting those needs, that dhikr sometimes it could flush out that vacuum and that felt. But if that is so, you're going back to that, as you said, could be developmental, right down to the roots of your identity, where you are interpreting reality through that framework, then unless you're directly tackling that prism and looking at its roots in a way that's gentle and providing the connection and trust for that to unfold into a more fruitful prism, the dhikr won't be able to help. Do you think that's a kind of a useful analogy?
It's a beautiful analogy, and something that I really resonate with and operate through on the day-to-day. Like in my line of work as a physician, we get people that, for example, I get a new patient. I spend 2 hours with them as a naturopath. getting to know them really, because it's not about just the symptoms and a pill for the symptoms, but really understanding what is the body, what is the ruh, the vital force, what is it expressing through these different symptoms that I can begin to help support by attuning to. So I have to spend the time to get to know the person really at a personal, deep level. And if they come back a month later and nothing's changed, I give them a whole treatment plan with diet, lifestyle optimization, herbs, a homeopathic remedy, some supplements, some exercises, invite them to clean the water and the air and eat organic and these types of things. They come back a month later and nothing's happened. This is all great stuff, right? Standard stuff. What do I do if nothing's happened? So other people, perhaps, will say, oh, this patient is, quote, non-compliant. They haven't been able to take what I've given them and make it useful. They're non-compliant. Stamping them, with a stamp of rejection, perhaps, or a label that is not really helpful to really helping this person overcome whatever they're going through. For me, I'm curious. Why are they not receptive? I know, alhamdulillah, I believe in my work, and I think this is actually really well indicated. There's something within them, like a knot, that does not allow them to, it's like to nourish themselves with these. What is it between themselves and themselves? This intra-psychic relationship, perhaps we can call it, this intra-soul relationship that things don't land with. It's like this idea of ilm and ilm nafi'. It's like the difference. You can have a lot of good and still not benefit from it one iota. In fact, and then it'll be a judgment against you. So it's like we have to talk about receptivity as opposed to just flooding people with the good in this abstract sense. It's the reign of quantity. It's like we need to kind of yield away from that, because that is one of the fundamental driving forces of modernity. Just more is better. And no, it's not. I'm sorry, it's not. Actually, it can be overwhelming. Constantly be told, do more, do more, do more. People burn out, which is a type of, we can say, trauma as well. I don't want to be so loose with that word, but and again, if we translate it as a psychobiological, biopsychosocial overwhelm, maybe we can get a broader base for that. But really, so it's the receptivity, and so it's like also a metaphor, for example, just for people maybe to understand this in a deeper way as well. When you eat organic food, you may get the best food, spend 2-3 times more than conventional produce to get the best organic, non-chemically altered and sprayed pesticide-laden food. But if your gut is inflamed, if your stomach and your small intestine is disturbed, is diseased, if the gut microbiome, the healthy gut bacteria that live and colonize the small intestine that help with assimilation of nutrients, and which allows for, when it's healthy, a healthy, robust immune system, a healthy hormone system, endocrine system, healthy cognition and focus. We know now the brain-gut connection is there. That's all about the gut microbiome. And what the gut microbiome is all about is diversity of the different bacteria. And so what I find fascinating is that the monoculture
destroys that.
Modern culture, literally, it's a monoculture of soil, the cultured soil, right? It's like there's so you have a diverse forest, for example, diverse forest of, teeming with plants and trees and insects and bugs and bees and animals and a stream that passes through it, and just teeming with life in this ecosystem that's whole. That's all connected. You take out one element and the whole ecosystem collapses. Now imagine modernity coming and plowing all of that forest and planting GMO soybeans instead. That's one culture, removing the diversity. And this is what we've done to much of the discourse. Much of our communal life has become plowed and become just this one solitary thing. And this has inflamed our receptivity to good.
Well, literally caused inflammation of our inwards,
of our souls, And now we can't accept anything. We can't benefit. So the same way we can't benefit from the food, you might eat organic food and then just evacuate, if you will, organic food. And you might be around people that are really loving and maybe want good for you, and yet because you haven't been able to heal from your toxic environments, then you're not allowing yourself to do that. And it's a self-preservation. And it's actually a beautiful type of adaptation. You can see how Allah Ta'ala designed these mechanisms within us to protect ourselves. This is all about protection of the heart. Sometimes when we guard too much, we disconnect from it. And so it's a matter of understanding this is not pathology. I never pathologize. I never diagnose in this way, especially with mental health disorders or mental health. I just use the word mental health issues or problems. But I don't like to use that diagnostic because it becomes, in labeling that thing, it becomes kind of a thing that they have to now cast off. They have to get rid of. They have to fight. Where it's not so much that. We don't want to bring more conflict. We want to, in the work, in NARM, for example, you mentioned NARM, we want to be able to understand how is this person organizing their internal world. So we want to help them be more receptive to beautiful things and the truth and their truth and love. How do we help them organize and make sense of their internal world? Being curious more than anything. We use a lot of soul inquiry. Really, we really do. And NARM that's what attracted me to NARM. It's a very process-oriented approach, and it helps to the helper to really get a sense of, and the person themselves, what is, where are the main blocks here? What is the belief system here? What is the relationship of the person with themselves? What are what we call the identifications? Are there processed emotions that have not been digested yet and assimilated? How do we, are there any somatic presentations attached to these symptoms? Right? The psychobiological kind of phenomenon. And how can we just really begin to understand this thing and not try to fix it? I don't come with my hammer and my tool. I bring presence, I bring compassion, and in doing that and allowing the person to really sit with the grief and make sense of it themselves, not being told, just themselves, like, yeah, I had to do this because I was hurt as a child, or I was heartbroken, I was left for dead, I was whatever. And I had to part of me said, never again. A part of me broke and it said, never again. And then all of these adaptations came online. And so many times, this is pre-verbal. You're not sitting there brooding, how can I protect myself? This is the soul itself, the vital force, the ruh al-haywani, the animal spirit itself being roused to protect.
It's an instinctive, it's part of our,
And so it's a matter of honoring that. And part of the work is really honoring this.
But
and
Father Sidi, finish what you're saying.
And then working to, bring about some sort of resolution such that we can now come back to our hearts. We can come back to our receptivity of truth and love, and be able to, accept those things again into our lives.
Yeah. Prior to, one of the people who I spoke to about trauma, who's also an expert, and he has a lot of clinical experience about this, was quite, he asked me a leading question. He said, do you think there's more trauma today than what existed previously? And I said, yes. And he said, well, how does that compare to the sacking of Baghdad, for instance, the average life expectancy being less, and so on? And what came to me alongside what we were discussing about just the atomization, the loss of community that we spoke about, the loss of the tribe, was a few other things you mentioned just now, which is that our diet itself, if you look at this, whether we go down the route of poultry, the trauma that's being induced in, say, chickens, or mass agriculture farming, or even fishes being congested and the mercury building up, or antibiotics being taken by ourselves that's weakening that gut bacteria, and so on. All of these things at purely a physiological level is opening up ourselves to the toxicity and trauma that would be around us. And then in addition, we've got the sensorial stimulation, and now we've got EMFs, electromagnetic fields, 5G all around. Yeah. Can you hear me, Mazen?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, with these phones. So the question then becomes, in a traditional sense, they seem to be that in the Hikmah tradition, there always is the Hakim, right? And the role of the Hakim is to ensure balance, and is to ensure what modality is suitable for whom at what time. And even, mashallah, your allusion to this Naam and some of the other, you see, you have a vast repertoire of tools that you use to heal. But it still comes back to you as a practitioner to kind of make a judgment call as to what's applicable to someone else. Isn't there always an inherent subjectivity in terms of the role of the healer? And can some healers be more dangerous than otherwise in terms of how they use these tools?
Absolutely. Everything has to be tailored.
Right.
And as a naturopathic doctor, of course, we have a therapeutic approach that I believe is very hikmah informed.
Right.
These things also go back a long time. And so I believe that there's an inspiration to even the naturopathic approach to allow for a full individualization. The homeopath in homeopathy also individualizes every single remedy, meaning I might have people with, I often say, this example, just is simple. 10 people with anxiety come in one day.
Right.
They may each receive a different homeopathic remedy, though clinically they have the same ICD, what we use in America, ICD-10 codes, the same kind of diagnostic codes that you submit for insurance reimbursement.
Right. Right.
It's the same exact diagnosis, and yet the treatment is totally other. Excuse me.
Right.
Also, their lifestyle. Are they in harmony with, the natural rhythms of what it means to be human? Are they eating well? Are they drinking enough water? Most of us are chronically dehydrated. Really, I mean, people do so well just by drinking more water. Really, I can't underestimate that enough. But that's a different conversation. But like these errors against natural law, we can call them.
Right.
The errors against what Allah Ta'ala wants for us as human beings to live as in balance through. Having a good diet, feasting and fasting, getting good sleep, having good exercise, moving our bodies. Al-harakatu baraka. How do we move our bodies properly? How do we get good rest? How do we love one another?
Right.
But when these things, there's errors in them, these are also like micro traumas, again, like micro aggravations that the body will compensate through. And so these are always things that you want to, always bring in, and there's individualization to that. Absolutely. But like for people that come in, go ahead.
Finish.
But people that go in, with trauma, it becomes kind of a little bit, more sensitive. It's not just, what's the best diet or what, how do we really bring what's most suitable for them before they even maybe open up to us.
Right.
So that can be challenging for sure. And, we always work with our clients, our patients, and tell them, listen, we're on this journey together.
Right.
There's a type of medicine called patriarchal medicine, which is much of the modern medical system is kind of based on this. I mean, it's kind of assumed kind of relationship style, if you will. And I'm always because of NARM, the relational piece, I'm always interested in questioning the relational style of
Right.
my. In the patriarchal system, it's like the doctor knows everything. He is the authority, and you are to go in and dictate your symptoms, and he is to prescribe for those symptoms.
Right.
And no really conversation. There isn't really getting to know the person. And again, you're non-compliant if you don't.
Right.
It's your problem, and you have to fix yourself, and then come and then you can be kind of worthy of this medicine that I have for you.
Right.
It's a weird kind of thing, right? Where in my kind of approach, I'm always keen. This is a healing journey, meaning for the both of us, we're both on this journey. And I often learn so much from I tell them, you teach me, and I help you, inshallah ta'ala, and Allah gives me tawfiq. But we're on this thing together, and sometimes what I give you may not be good for you. It may seem right for me after my assessment, but it may not be right. So we can always just, as long as we have a relationship, the most important part of the healing journey is the companionship of the if you will, the healer and the patient, or the helper and the patient. That relationship is sacred, and I really believe it is. That doctor-patient relationship is sacred, and there's so much, because there's so much vulnerability there. There's so much openness there, and kind of other types of things, other types of rules, maybe to that type of relationship may go away. In terms of what we can speak about and stuff like this, like things are maybe kind of more open. So in that, and of course, what the transformation that can arise from this relationship, inshallah ta'ala, as well, that makes it very
Mm.
special too. But it's that relationship that really offers the fertile soil by which now we can begin to do this work and find solutions for the patient, right? I like to have my kind of vast array of modalities because I want to be able to help as many people as possible.
Right.
But I don't. Yeah, but you have to always kind of be humble in the sense that you don't always know what is good for the person, and so, excuse me. So we want to be able to just recognize our fallibility,
Mm.
our weaknesses, and be open to just trying different things. And that's really super 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 important, because otherwise you try to save, you try to become the savior. I'm going to save the damsel in distress, I'm going to save this guy from drowning in the ocean, I'm going to be the hero here. And that's what we call countertransference.
Mm.
So
Mm.
we don't want to do that. That muddles the field. When you kind of bring your baggage and your needs into the space now, you need to help them because you feel uncomfortable not knowing something.
Mm. What I'm getting from you is, mashallah, like a lot of the core principles about healing, just this intention, um, and just allowing for Allah to be the healer is part of this process. We've got a few callers, and Mazen, I'd love to continue speaking to you, and we could just go forever. There's some things I would want to pick up, maybe not on this call, maybe another one sometime, about discussions about Muslim leadership. And so we can take up this call a bit further about whether ulama are there. So we've got we've got Farzana here, and just to say, Sidi Idris Watts is sending his salam, saying great to see you.
Salam.
So is Farzana still there, Tariq? Can she come in? Yeah. So Farzana is just connecting. When Farzana comes through, we'll have her ask her question. We're just going to get some live callers in, and if maybe
Welcome.
Yeah.
Sure. Bismillah.
So Farzana, feel free to ask your question.
Alaikum. We live in a world where you have two types of people. So those that have got trauma and they know about it and are actively trying to do something about it. And then you have the other type who have no idea that they've got trauma, but they have. And there's always that struggle between the two. So how do you deal with the people that don't realize they have trauma, and a lot of their trauma affects other people and gives them trauma?
Yeah, right. Thank you. Good question. Great question. Difficult question. Because I wish I had the perfect answer for that. We all know, we've all lived long enough that you can't change people. You can't force change. لا إكراه في الدين, and then also لا إكراه في الشفاء, في العلاج. You just can't force people to see things that they have this inner guarding to not see, to not change, not hold space for. And so, not everyone's receptive at every moment. The only thing that we are responsible for, really, ultimately, is ourselves. And the more that we're able to clarify for ourselves what is going on and how is this person affecting me? What is it within me that makes me susceptible to their influences, for example? That's a very interesting kind of point of departure. And there's a lot of good work that you can do when you ask those questions to yourself. Whether, I can give you an answer here to, help you tomorrow go and like stop their harm. I'm not sure. If there's like a narcissist, for example, it's very difficult to really connect with these people. It's very difficult. They don't trust anybody. In the NARM work that we do, there's 5 strategies possible, the 5 relational strategies that emerge. And the narcissist is the trust style, meaning they trust nobody, right? And they're very grandiose, and they're larger than life, and they have small inner circles, and they try to control out there. The trust style does not change themselves. They don't connect with themselves in the first place. They control other people. They're users. They're objectifiers. As opposed to the autonomy style, which really, everyone else knows better than me. I'm nobody, and they're very harsh on themselves that way. And so they're always trying to change themselves, but we call that people pleasing. They don't know who they are. The narcissist, for example, it's very difficult to reach with them. Even clinically, you never get a trust style walking into your door. Very rare. I've had some, alhamdulillah, but very rare because they're not receptive to it. And so in some way, mashallah, there's no real answer here, but beyond just, and I offer this to you. I wish I had more answers for you, but really taking care of yourself, defending yourself, and avoiding the person and trying to speak with other people and help them see, of course, what is going on, because some people may not see what you see. But helping people recognize, what is the reality of this thing, can help people kind of begin to shift out of their victim mindset, meaning they're allowing of themselves getting hurt, into a more resilient and more life affirmative type of state. Allah Ta'ala.
Sister Farzana, do you have anything you want to add to that question, or?
No, that's fine. That's good.
Thank you. Mazen, inshallah, we might have a few more questions coming through, but just on that point, I mean, just these classifications of people. We've got someone coming through, so I'll have to be quiet because I've had my fair share of conversation. So we've got Farhina Ahmed as a caller coming through. She's got a question to ask. She just left. So inshallah, if she wants to call again, or anyone else wants to call to ask. I think how long have we got with you, Mazen? We don't want to take up, because I know it's really early in the day. This is your family time here, Saturday.
Maybe another 20 minutes or so.
20 minutes. Okay, so we've got about 20 minutes. Inshallah, if anyone wants to call, we've got about a 20-minute window for calls and for written questions. Just on this point, when we kind of classify people, and I'm sure, as you said, they're not done as to typecast people, but they're just there in terms of facilitating healing and the kind of guidelines. But when we classify someone as narcissistic, and there can be an almost shutting a door, and because it's not a very pleasant classification. And so what's the scope for someone who is deemed to be narcissistic to be healed? How would you go around healing someone? Because it sounds as it does sound as a judgment on the face of it. Some people probably need to be called that, but yeah.
Yeah, you don't tell them that, of course. And you shouldn't call anyone anything, because that's not who they really are. Right? Hurt people. That's the reality, And people will adjust to their own hurt in different ways. Some people are really hard on themselves, others are hard on other people. But really, this is the core of it. But at the end of the day, even if you tell them, hey, you're a narcissist and you need to get some help, if it doesn't land with, if they're not willing to change, you cannot change them. Again, this whole receptivity thing, if you give them nasiha and they don't believe that there's anything wrong with them, and they feel the world is scary and distrustful, I've been betrayed by the world, and I will never open up again, and you're part of this world and you're telling me that it's wrong with me? No, you're the problem. You're all the problem. It's not me. It's difficult to reach that person, you see. It's very difficult. And these people, it's like, and I speak to that question is a difficult question for me. She didn't say narcissist, but, ideally most people, you want to be able to put space between you and people that are harmful. But if they happen to be a narcissist, you have no choice but really doing that, because, subhanAllah, there's no receptivity. It's very little. And sometimes they can shift out of it themselves. Sometimes, again, maybe the loss of a child or something will just wake them up. Grief can do that. Grief can open up the heart. That's been scarred after previous hurt. And they are open to it. They can we can kind of like reconfigure that relationship. They can renegotiate, we say, that relationship with themselves in a healthier way. But sometimes with a narcissist, they have to get, like, Allah shocks them again, because it's like nothing else can reach them. So they have to lose something, or, get sick, or, have a near-death experience or something like this, just to kind of just snap out of it, because they're so guarded. They're so locked in their own fortress.
So is the hikmah model just to wait for that shock? Can the Hakim not kind of subtly, through hikmah, kind of reflect the mirror back?
You can try. You can try. And the point is, you don't, if someone comes to me like that, I hold so much, I have maybe even more, inshallah, more compassion for them, because I know they're, whatever they're doing to people, they feel themselves against themselves. They feel against themselves even more so. That's just kind of like the pressure valve, really. And so just being able to see that, and even, Gabor Mate, the Dr. Gabor Mate, he does a lot of this type of work, and he brings up the example of Trump, this very grandiose, puts his name on buildings, larger than life kind of figure. And yeah, you can see that he's a very, subhanAllah,
there's trauma
immature. There. Yeah, there's trauma. And you see his childhood, and his father was like him, so what do you do when your father is like a Trump? Either there's two choices. Either you evade, you run away, you turn maybe to addictions, which is what his brother did, who ended up killing himself, or you become like that. You become, and Trump, his brother, took the other route, and he's not with us anymore. And Trump became like his father, and that's how he's protected himself from the wound of having a father, the narcissist. He became one too.
How do you? Yeah, how do you, break that cycle? Sidi Idris has just commented on how sometimes these trust style types are dragged into couples therapy by their partner, but they're not necessarily willing themselves.
That's right. They can be compelled patients, so people can, like, if like the spouse says, you must get help or I'm going to divorce you, or they can be a incarcerated person who said, you will not get parole unless you get help. You have to go through X amount of counseling. For example, they'll show up, but they may show up and be like this: I'm not telling you nothing. So again, it goes back ultimately to the receptivity. Trust style is notorious, and even, for example, in the NARM training, there's very few trust style demonstrations that they give because we just don't have as many.
Couple of questions, and one of them I'll tie into what you said. So I'll give them both at the same time. They're not necessarily the same. So the first is, in light of what you spoke about this Trump father kind of generational cycle, how do we break the cycle of generational trauma, and specifically with regards to what's happening now with the Afro-American community, through generations of trauma that the community has been subject to? And some now is that now the voices that there's this whole spectrum of voices. I know Imam Zaid was kind of talking about the need to deal with ourselves in our articulation of activism. And there are other voices that are saying, you taught us violence, and so we learned it from you. And so we're going to echo that. And so it's acting from that place of trauma. So how can this kind of treatment alleviate that kind of extreme felt sense? And the second question is unrelated, and I think we'll probably leave this as the last, unless somebody comes in before you wrap up, which is, what are some of the physical manifestations of these kind of spiritual kind of underpinnings that people undergo? So how does this translate to a physiological kind of dimension in terms of treatment and in terms of the felt sense? So feel free to answer both of them.
Yeah, I'll start with the second one. So in terms of the physical, it can be anything. So we have constitutional weaknesses, depending on just our genetics, if you will, our inheritance, so forth. And so, sometimes things will emerge at the hormone level. So you have a lot of thyroid stuff, you have maybe some PCOS for women, hormone-related issues. Sometimes people have a lot of IBS and gut disturbances, so irritable bowel syndrome, what they call IBDs, inflammatory bowel disorders like Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis. You have autoimmune diseases, which are not always just connected with trauma. Usually there's other components like, again, errors in diet and toxins, in the food and the water and the air and all this. But these things all relate, and they all connect, and it's not just one thing. And they kind of work synergistically, or, kind of against you possibly, as the body kind of responds to all of them. And so it can be anything in a nutshell. It could be anything. Be chronic pain, chronic fatigue syndrome, or these types of fibromyalgia. These, we call these diagnoses of exclusion, which are pretty much like, you go to a doctor and you tell them, I have this and that and this and that, and they say, well, the testing came out fine, so there's nothing wrong with you, so you have fibromyalgia. Or you have chronic fatigue syndrome, which is not useful at all. Like, what does that even mean? How do I treat someone who has chronic fatigue? I'm really tired all the time. That's what you're saying. You know, but basically he's saying deeper, I don't know what's going on and I can't help you. So, you know, usually these types of things, they do have a more subtle component, and more of a psychological, emotional component. Usually always, in fact.
I mean, just that questioner was a physician, so he actually operates on people. So he's actually asking neurologist,
Urologist, yeah, exactly. And so these are things that, you know, all these things are possible. And so you have to be able to kind of allow for the person to show up and take a good case, right? Case management, case taking for us is super important, because you want to capture as much of the picture as possible, as much of the totality of the presentation as possible, mental, emotional, you know, and physical and physiological and structural and relational and spiritual. I mean, these are all components of the person's experience, and there are health markers in each of those dimensions that, you know, one clue of one of those dimensions may be, you know, what you need to prescribe something appropriate. You know, I mean, I don't know how many times I've had a homeopathic intake, for example, which takes about 2 hours. I really have to individualize it very keenly and directly. And it may be like I'm kind of confused, and then wrapping up, I'm like, you know, I'm gonna have to think about this and spend some time doing some research, really find what I feel comfortable with prescribing. And then they'll say, oh, by the way, I didn't mention this. And then that's the key. Last minute, just, oh yeah. And so it's usually those subtle kind of subjective. I'm not sure this is important. It kind of shows up here and there, but that is the key. So good case taking and good case assessment is crucial. But yeah, anything is possible physically. So I hope that answers the second question. The first question, I've actually been kind of just avoiding speaking on this, right? Kind of a hot topic issue. And there's a lot of charge here right now, currently in the US. There's a lot of charge. And so I've been kind of giving it time and space, and not kind of feeling the need to chime in necessarily too much. I chimed in a little bit so far, but, you know, of course, what's going on is linked with trauma. You know, this is all these systems of abuse, systems of oppression, they're systems of chronic traumatization of peoples. And, you know, these things will affect the population. And because they most likely, I mean, well, for sure, we're not given avenues of healing and restoration and recovery, that those things are transmitted like the al-hal yasri, right? In the good sense of the sheikh of tarbiyah, of suluk, you know, seeing the person and their niyyah, and then making dua for them, and just the person is affected by that. And yet also, you know, in some way, the negative way of being of people that are unwell, it will affect the individual. And so these are things that are not necessarily genetic. They can be, but that changes over long periods of time, you know, 50,000 years, 100,000 years, where we know that we can be affected in just one generation by, you know, trauma. And so it's not genetic. It's more so, if you will, the morphic field, maybe we can say the morphic resonance of a whole family unit being transmitted down. And so this is trauma through and through, absolutely. And so once we recognize that, and that the root of this is pain and grief and suffering, then you can see their, you know, acting out, maybe we can call it, you know, this anger and this aggression and this, you know, inflamed type of, you know, response as something that is coming as a, you know, almost boiling over of this grief and this anger and this rage and this suppression. Suppression is never the solution to anything. And so this is the natural consequence. I mean, this was inevitable, absolutely, you know. And in some way, you know, it can be useful, of course, but in another way, for example, in the work, you know, you mentioned other types of somatic therapies. NARM is one of them, but there's a whole array of them. There's one of them called TRE, and it's not a bashing TRE. It has its place, but one of the, you know, TRE is tension releasing exercises by David Berceli. I love it. I use it. It's great. But in some way, it's cathartic. It's just, you kind of vomit the stress. You vomit the trauma out of your system. It's kind of like a purging, somatic purging of someone. So opening up the valve a little bit more than usual and just trying to get it out. In childhood trauma, it's not very useful because there's still the interrelational, intrapsychic relationship that shows up. But in some way, if it's shock trauma, it can be useful taking the edge off the nervous system. In some way, Allah Ta'ala Alam, and I don't want to overstep here. But, it's like these behaviors are in some way just this opening of the valve. It's not restoring anything. It's not bringing the community's agency back online. Their sense of identity, the sense of justice, the sense of compassion and love for one another and themselves first and foremost. It's just anger. And is it justified? Perhaps. I mean, they have gone through what no peoples have gone through, really. And so I'm not here to judge them, but in wanting to help them to identify this is what's going on here. And the real solution to your problems is in some way doing really deep grief work, deep healing work, entering that liminal space, entering that sacred barzakh of the healing space where you can really begin to face this grief, not just act out through it, which inshallah ta'ala finds people connecting to themselves in a deeper way perhaps now, which is the beginning. But as this settles, this is not going to last forever. As this settles, I hope they don't revert. We don't revert to a type of relationship with ourselves and just have this, we've had this before. A few years ago after Ferguson, there was other types of kind of protest and stuff like that. 4 years ago, almost exactly. And things went back to normal. Because there needs to be a tangible shift in the way that people are relating to themselves and their grief and the suffering, not just getting angry and putting signs up, though you can do that. But in conjunction with this, really being able to identify the trauma and the implications of the trauma and the branches of the trauma, the individual and the collective, and all the things that come about from that, and be able to now grieve and heal and, recalibrate, or what's the word I used earlier? Renegotiate now who we are. Who are we as African American? Who are we as so-and-so? And not accepting the narratives that oftentimes, they are given, and claiming it for themselves, defining it for themselves. Like, for example, was done with the nation, like was done with the Panthers. Like these people, they saw, we don't believe this. We're not gonna just protest what we're, our anger. We're going to take it one step further. We're going to posit who we are truly. We are human beings. We're strong. We have agency. We have self-actualization. We don't need the system. Now you become freed from that in some way. And it has to be done healthy, and it has to be done in a sustainable way. But that is in some way, coming forward in some way and positing something fresh and new. That can't be done if you haven't healed.
I think this is not so much the last question, but the last request from people out there. And we'll wrap up here. Mashallah, I think everything you've said is nasiha. It's all been good advice, but they're specifically asking a more general form of advice that the one take home, if you could give someone in terms of their interaction with trauma, either with themselves or with those around them, what's the big ingredient that's needed that would kind of recalibrate or readjust people to a way that allows for healing? And the same thing that we just spoke about the Afro-American community obviously applies to a whole host of Muslim communities,
Everybody.
Palestinians, refugees across the world, Yemen, Syria. So how do we make this a kind of an imperative that we need to start embodying? What's the nasiha you'd give us?
We have to know that hope is available to us constantly, that nothing, is fixed. Nothing about you right now is, calcified or, unchangeable, you have this amazing capacity to transform yourself every day of your life. I had a 60-year-old man come in last month, Syrian ammo uncle come in. He says, I'm retired, but I feel like I have so much more to give. I want you to help me clear what is in the way of my heart, of my mind, so that I can contribute and serve the ummah before I die more.
MashaAllah. MashaAllah.
I love this man. I love this man so deeply now because of, just the first thing he's told me. I did work with him for a while. That first thing, I'm like, I love you so much. And the door is never closed. The same way the door is never closed with Tawbah. And people should never, close that door on themselves. Always the hope is there, the love of Allah Ta'ala is there, and Allah Ta'ala wants you to be well. He wants you to be well. He wants you to heal. He wants you to connect with yourself and integrate your heart and your mind and your soul such that you can be at one with yourself, so that you can be at one with Him, which is your entire task here. So healing has a direct implication and connection with, your ibadah and your akhirah and all of that. But really recognizing that trauma is a reality, of course. And just because that you have been dealing with it for some time does not mean that you have to deal with it for the rest of your time here. It is not a death sentence. It is an invitation, in fact. Trauma itself is an invitation to what you can be. MashaAllah. And so really being able to expose yourself to that divine gust. And know that things are plastic. The mind is plastic. Your body can change. You can work out, you can fast, you can eat more, and your body, everything's always changing, whatever you do to it. And same with your heart. And in some way, trauma, if you were to, it's not a comprehensive definition, but in some way, trauma is something that comes in the way of connecting to your heart.
Allah.
Really, this fragmentation, this dissociation, this disconnection. And so knowing that at the end of the day, Allah wants you to connect to your heart. And if trauma healing and coming back to, that through the ways of grief work and somatic work and renegotiation of these old patterns of yours are what need to be done, then bismillah. Find help and find support and pray istikhara and, do all the things that you know to do as a Muslim to seek that aid and facilitation. And then find people that you trust, that you feel safe with. There's many people, alhamdulillah, that are doing this type of work. And know that hope is always there and you can always change. And people are doing it all the time, alhamdulillah.
Jazakallah khair, Sidi Mazen. MashaAllah, that was a great point to end this with. The Prophet's own advice was, if the final hour comes and you can just plant the seed, plant it. And always having a good opinion that Allah's creating everything for us, for our healing, inshallah ta'ala. So husna billah. So jazakallah khair again. Inshallah ta'ala, we hope to have you on again sometime in the near future. This has been really beneficial. Welcome, jazakallah khair. So with that we'll end. Subhanaka wa bihamdik, subhanal azim, wal asr, innal insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa tawassaw bis sabr. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.